Venezuela forces Washington into a geopolitical earthquake no one saw coming. Let me take you back to July 30, 2024, a date that, on the surface, seemed like just another diplomatic spat in a long line of US-Venezuela tensions. That was the day Nicolas Maduro's government announced it had seized a U.S. oil company's assets in the Orinoco Belt, the largest proven oil reserve on the planet, and handed operational control to a Chinese-Russian consortium. The White House called it economic warfare. The State Department threatened swift and severe consequences. The New York Times ran a front-page story about Venezuela's reckless provocation. And yet, if you were paying attention not to the headlines, but to the deeper currents beneath them, you'd have realized something far more significant was Venezuela had just backed the United States into a corner it couldn't escape without either losing face or risking a catastrophic escalation. I've spent the last 3 decades studying great power competition, resource geopolitics, and the slow-motion collapse of U.S. hegemony. And what I saw in that moment wasn't just another Latin American crisis, it was a masterclass in how a weaker state can outmaneuver a superpower when the rules of the game have changed. This wasn't about oil. It wasn't even really about Venezuela. This was about the end of an era, and the beginning of something far more dangerous. Now, before we go any further, let's talk about what you've probably been told. Because the official narrative is where the real deception begins. The official what they want you to believe. The story, as it's been presented, goes something like Venezuela, a rogue state under the authoritarian rule of Nicolas Maduro, has once again defied international norms by expropriating U.S. assets, violating sanctions, and cozying up to America's adversaries. The seizure of the Orinoco Belt operations, previously managed by Chevron under a limited U.S. license, was a brazen act of economic aggression, designed to fund Maduro's regime while undermining U.S. energy security. The White House, in response, has no choice but to tighten the more sanctions, more diplomatic isolation, and if necessary, a show of military force to deter further provocations. The numbers seem to back this up. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia. The Orinoco Belt alone produces over 800,000 barrels per day, and under the new arrangement, China's CNPC and Russia's Rosneft will now control the lion's share of that output. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that Venezuela's oil exports to China have already surged by 40% since the deal was announced, while Russia has quietly increased its military advisors in the country. Meanwhile, Maduro's approval ratings have ticked up for the first time in years, thanks to a combination of economic relief and nationalist rhetoric about standing up to the empire. The media has played its part perfectly. CNN ran a segment on how Venezuela's oil grab threatens U.S. gas prices. The Wall Street Journal published an editorial warning that Maduro is playing with fire. Even progressive outlets like The Intercept framed the story as a classic David and Goliath struggle, with Venezuela as the plucky underdog resisting U.S. imperialism. And in a way, that's exactly what the Maduro government wants you to believe. But here's the problem with this: it's not just incomplete, it's actively misleading. Because what's really happening in Venezuela isn't about oil, or sanctions, or even Maduro's survival. It's about something far the unraveling of U.S. dominance in its own backyard, and the emergence of a new multipolar order that Washington is powerless to stop. The hidden facts behind the headlines. Let's start with the most glaring omission in the official: the fact that the U.S. has already lost in Venezuela. Not in the way you might think. This isn't about military defeat or regime change. It's about the slow, inexorable erosion of American influence in a country that, for over a century, was treated as little more than a U.S. client state. The truth is, the Orinoco Belt seizure wasn't a sudden act of defiance. It was the culmination of a decade-long strategy by Maduro to diversify Venezuela's economic and military dependencies away from the United States. And here's the U.S. let it happen. Not because of incompetence, but because of a fundamental misreading of the geopolitical landscape. Consider the timeline. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, imposed crippling sanctions, and even flirted with military intervention. The goal was regime change, simple, clean, and by the book. But then something unexpected: the sanctions didn't work. Instead of collapsing, Maduro's government adapted. It turned to China for loans, to Russia for military support, and to Iran for sanctions-busting expertise. By 2022, Venezuela was exporting more oil than it had in years, not to the US, but to China and India, via a shadow fleet of tankers that Washington couldn't touch. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Biden administration, recognizing that the maximum pressure strategy had failed, quietly began back-channel negotiations with Maduro in 2023. The goal? To secure a limited sanctions relief deal in exchange for free and fair elections. But there was a Maduro wasn't interested in playing by US rules. He knew that if he gave an inch, the US would demand a mile. So instead, he did something far smarter. He accelerated his pivot to China and Russia, knowing that the US couldn't afford to let those two powers gain a permanent foothold in its hemisphere. And that brings us to the Orinoco Belt. The US had been allowing Chevron to operate in Venezuela under a narrow license, ostensibly to support the Venezuelan people. But in reality, it was a fig leaf away for the Biden administration to claim it was still engaging with Maduro while avoiding the political fallout of lifting sanctions entirely. Maduro, however, saw the license for what had a vulnerability. By seizing Chevron's assets and handing them to China and Russia, he wasn't just defying the US, he was forcing Washington to choose between two terrible options. Option: do nothing, and admit that the US no longer has the leverage to dictate terms in its own backyard. Option: escalate sanctions, naval blockades, even military strikes, and risk a direct confrontation with Russia and China in a region where the US is already stretched thin. Neither option is good. And that's the PA. The extant geopolitical how Venezuela became the front line of a new Cold War. To understand why this matters, you have to out. Because Venezuela isn't just a country, it's a battleground in the most consequential geopolitical struggle of the 21st, the contest between a declining US unipolar order and a rising multipolar world led by China and Russia. For decades, the US operated under the assumption that it could maintain its dominance through a combination of military power, economic coercion, and ideological hegemony. The Washington Consensus wasn't just an economic doctrine, it was a geopolitical strategy. And for a while, it worked. But then came the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, and the rise of China as an economic superpower. Suddenly, the old playbook stopped working. Now, we're in what I call the interregnum, the messy, dangerous period between the end of one global order and the emergence of another. And in this interregnum, the rules have changed. The US can no longer dictate terms unilaterally. Its adversaries have learned to play the game differently. And Venezuela is the perfect case study in how this new game is being played. Let's break it down. 1. The China, the economic lever. China isn't just Venezuela's biggest creditor, it's its lifeline. Since 2007, Beijing has loaned Caracas over $60 billion, most of it secured against future oil deliveries. And unlike the US, China doesn't care about human rights or democracy. It cares about stability and resources. So when Maduro seized the Orinoco Belt, China didn't flinch. It saw an opportunity to lock in long-term access to Venezuela's oil at a time when global energy markets are tightening. But here's the part the media isn't talking: China isn't just buying oil. It's building infrastructure. Ports, refineries, even a new deepwater terminal in the Caribbean that could one day serve as a logistics hub for the Belt and Road Initiative. And crucially, it's doing all of this with Russian backing. Which brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. 2. The military lever. Russia's involvement in Venezuela is often dismissed as a publicity stunt, Putin's way of poking the US in the eye. But that's a dangerous underestimation. Since 2019, Russia has deployed long-range bombers, missile defense systems, and even little green men to Venezuela. In 2023, it signed a deal to modernize Venezuela's air defenses, effectively turning the country into a forward operating base for Russian power projection in the Western Hemisphere. Now, why would Russia do this? Because it understands something the US has in the 21st century: power isn't just about aircraft carriers and nuclear arsenals. It's about presence. And by establishing a permanent military foothold in Venezuela, Russia isn't just challenging the US, it's rewriting the rules of the game. 3. The US. The strategic blind spot. And this is where the US finds itself in a bind. Because for all its military might, it's operating under a set of assumptions that no longer hold true. First, there's the assumption that economic sanctions will eventually force compliance. But as we've seen in Iran, North Korea, and now Venezuela, sanctions don't work when the target country has alternative patrons. China and Russia have built entire parallel financial systems to bypass US dollar dominance. And they're more than happy to prop up regimes that the US wants to isolate. Second, there's the assumption that the US can still dictate outcomes in its own hemisphere. But the Monroe Doctrine is dead, and Latin America is no longer a US lake. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina are hedging their bets, balancing relations with Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. And Venezuela? It's gone all in on the multipolar world. Third, there's the assumption that the US can afford to ignore Venezuela because it's not a core interest. But that's exactly the kind of thinking that got the US into trouble in the Middle East. Because once you cede ground in one theater, your adversaries will test you in another. And right now, China and Russia are testing the US in its own backyard. Military and strategic, the illusion of a quick fix. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because if you listen to the hawks in Washington, the solution to the Venezuela problem is a naval blockade, a few airstrikes, maybe even a limited ground incursion. After all, how hard could it be? Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it once was. Its air force is outdated. Its navy is a joke. And Maduro's regime is unpopular. But here's where the hawks are dangerously wrong. First, there's the Russia factor. Any US military action in Venezuela would risk a direct confrontation with Russian forces. And unlike in Syria, where the US and Russia have deconfliction mechanisms, Venezuela is a gray zone. There are no rules. No guardrails. Just two nuclear-armed powers operating in close proximity with no clear red lines. Second, there's the China factor. A US attack on Venezuela would be seen as an attack on Chinese economic interests. And China has ways of retaliating that don't involve sending troops. It could dump US Treasury bonds. It could cut off rare earth exports. It could escalate in the South China Sea. The point is, the US isn't just fighting Venezuela, it's fighting a coalition. Third, there's the domestic factor. Venezuela isn't Iraq or Libya. It's not a failed state. It's a country with a functioning government, a battle-hardened military, and a population that, while unhappy with Maduro, would rally around the flag in the event of a foreign invasion. And let's not Venezuela has one of the highest gun ownership rates in the world. A US occupation would be a quagmire. And that's before we even get to the regional backlash. Latin America is already wary of US interventionism. A military strike on Venezuela would unite the continent against the US in a way we haven't seen since the Cold War. Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, they'd all condemn it. And that's not even counting the global reaction. China and Russia would have a field day, framing the US as the aggressor in a new era of imperialism. So no, there is no quick fix. The US is stuck. And that's exactly where Maduro wants it. The domestic political why Biden can't walk away. But here's the thing about it's never just about the external game. It's also about the internal one. And in the US, the Venezuela crisis is playing out against the backdrop of a deeply polarized political landscape, one where foreign policy is increasingly driven by domestic imperatives. Let's start with the 2024 election. Biden is in a tough spot. His approval ratings are underwater. Inflation is still a problem. And the progressive wing of his party is pushing for a more restrained foreign policy. But on Venezuela, he's caught between a rock and a hard place. If he does nothing, the Republicans will hammer him for being weak on communism. They'll point to the Orinoco Belt seizure as proof that Biden's soft approach has emboldened America's enemies. And they'll use it to rally their base, especially in Florida, where the Venezuelan exile community is a powerful voting bloc. But if he escalates, if he imposes new sanctions, or worse, authorizes military action, he risks alienating his own base. Progressives are already furious about his support for Israel in Gaza. They're not going to tolerate another foreign adventure, especially one that could spiral into a wider conflict with Russia and China. And then there's the oil factor. The US is the world's largest oil producer, but it's also the world's largest consumer. And while the Orinoco Belt's output isn't critical to US energy security, the perception of vulnerability matters. If gas prices spike because of Venezuela, Biden's re-election chances take a hit. And the Republicans know it. So what's a president to do? The answer, unfortunately, is to double down on a failed strategy. Because in Washington, the path of least resistance is almost always the path of least wisdom. Scenario how this ends. So where does this go from here? Let's run through the scenarios, because none of them are pretty. Scenario 1, the US backs down. In this scenario, the Biden administration quietly accepts the Orinoco Belt seizure as a fait accompli. It imposes some symbolic sanctions, maybe expels a few Venezuelan diplomats, but otherwise does nothing. Maduro declares victory. China and Russia consolidate their position. And the US loses credibility in the region. This is the best-case scenario for the US, but it's also the least likely. Because in Washington, backing down is political suicide. The hawks would crucify Biden. The Republicans would use it as a cudgel in the election. And the media would frame it as a humiliation. Scenario 2, the US escalates economically. This is the most likely outcome. The US imposes secondary sanctions on Chinese and Russian firms operating in Venezuela. It designates Venezuela's oil sector as a sanctions evasion hub. It pressures allies like India and Brazil to stop buying Venezuelan oil. And it ramps up support for the Venezuelan opposition. But here's the this won't work. China and Russia will simply reroute the oil through third parties. The sanctions will hurt ordinary Venezuelans, not Maduro. And the opposition, which is already fractured, will be further weakened. Meanwhile, Maduro will use the sanctions as a propaganda tool, framing himself as the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty against US imperialism. In the end, the US will have spent political capital for no gain. And China and Russia will have strengthened their position. Scenario 3, the US escalates militarily. This is the nightmare scenario. The US imposes a naval blockade on Venezuela. It conducts airstrikes on oil facilities. It even sends in special forces to stabilize the country. And then all hell breaks loose. Russia responds by increasing its military presence in Venezuela. China retaliates economically. The region erupts in protests. And the US finds itself bogged down in another endless conflict, this time in its own backyard. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because it's not just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of US deterrence. If the US can't enforce its will in its own hemisphere, what does that say about its ability to do so anywhere else? Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. So what does all of this mean for the bigger picture? It means we're witnessing the death of the idea that the US can maintain its global dominance through a combination of military power, economic coercion, and ideological hegemony. For decades, the US operated under what political scientists call liberal hegemony, the belief that the world is better off when the US is the sole superpower, and that it's America's responsibility to enforce the rules of the international order. But liberal hegemony has a fatal flaw: it assumes that other powers will accept American primacy indefinitely. And in 2024, that assumption is dead. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of a much larger system. The US has spent the last 30 years acting as the world's policeman, but the world no longer wants or fears that policeman. The sanctions on Venezuela? They're just the latest example of a tool that's lost its edge. The US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has sanctioned over 9,000 entities since 2001, but the results have been mixed at best. Iran is still standing. North Korea is still testing missiles. And Venezuela? It's not just surviving, it's thriving as a sanctions-busting hub, with Russian and Chinese middlemen turning its oil into a fungible commodity on the global market. Let me explain why this matters. The US still has the world's largest economy and the most powerful military, but power isn't just about capability, it's about credibility. And right now, American credibility is in freefall. The Biden administration's response to Venezuela has been a masterclass in strategic incoherence. One day, it's easing sanctions to secure a temporary electoral deal, the next, it's reimposing them to punish Maduro for reneging on that same deal. The message to the world? The US is reactive, not strategic. It's playing whack-a-mole with crises instead of shaping the environment. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is no longer the only game in town. China and Russia have spent the last decade building alternative financial systems, military alliances, and trade networks precisely to undermine American leverage. The Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS Action, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, these aren't just buzzwords. They're the scaffolding of a new multipolar order. And Venezuela is a critical node in that order. When Maduro visited Beijing in 2023, he didn't just come home with a fistful of investment deals, he secured a commitment to deepen military cooperation, including joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. That's not a coincidence. It's a signal. The military implications are even more alarming. The U.S. Southern Command has been sounding the alarm for years about Russia's growing footprint in the Western Hemisphere. In 2019, two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed in Venezuela, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. Then, in 2022, Russia deployed a contingent of Wagner Group mercenaries to the country, ostensibly to protect oil facilities but more likely to train Venezuelan forces in asymmetric warfare. The U.S. response? A few sternly worded statements and a handful of sanctions on Russian officials. That's it. Now, imagine if the US actually tried to enforce a naval blockade on Venezuela. The Russians have already pre-positioned assets in the region. Their Admiral Gorshkov frigate, armed with hypersonic Zircon missiles, has been making port calls in Havana. The Chinese have their own naval base in Djibouti, but they've also been extending their presence in the Caribbean, with intelligence gathering ships like the Yuan Wang 5 docking in Cuba. If the US moves against Venezuela, it won't just be facing Maduro's decrepit military, it'll be staring down a coalition of revisionist powers who see this as their chance to humiliate Washington on its own doorstep. And that's the real danger. The US isn't just risking a quagmire in Venezuela, it's risking a broader collapse of its deterrence in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine is already a relic, but if the US can't even enforce its will in a country that's literally on its southern border, what does that say about its ability to project power in the South China Sea or Eastern Europe? The answer is it says that the era of uncontested American hegemony is over. This isn't just about oil or elections. It's about the future of global order. The US has two: it can double down on coercion and risk a catastrophic miscalculation, or it can accept that the world is changing and adapt. The problem is that the foreign policy establishment in Washington is still stuck in the 1990s, clinging to the belief that the US can dictate outcomes through sheer force of will. But the world has moved on. China and Russia aren't just passive observers, they're active players, and they're writing the rules of the new game. The question is, will the US learn to play by those rules, or will it keep trying to rewrite them in its own image? Because if history is any guide, the latter approach is a recipe for disaster. Just ask the British Empire. Or the Soviet Union. Or, for that matter, the US itself in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The lesson is when you overreach, you lose. And right now, the US is teetering on the edge of another overreach, this time in its own backyard. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy crisis, it's a domestic political tinderbox waiting to explode. The Biden administration, already weakened by a fractured Democratic coalition and a Republican Party that smells blood in the water, is walking a razor's edge. Every move it makes in Venezuela will be dissected not just in Caracas or Moscow, but in Miami, Houston, and the halls of Congress. And here's the uncomfortable: the US political system is structurally incapable of handling this kind of multi-front pressure without resorting to either paralysis or recklessness. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela isn't just another foreign policy file for Washington, it's a domestic identity crisis wrapped in a geopolitical chess match. The Cuban-American lobby, long a kingmaker in Florida politics, has spent decades framing Venezuela as the next domino in the fight against socialism. They've got the ear of Marco Rubio, who's already been beating the war drums, and they've got the cash to influence swing state elections. But here's the Venezuelan American community is far from monolithic. Polling from the Venezuelan American Caucus shows that while 68% of Venezuelan exiles support tougher sanctions, only 34% back military intervention, a gap that's widening as younger generations prioritize family reunification over regime change. That's a political minefield for any administration, but especially for one that can't afford to lose Florida in 2024. Then there's the oil factor. The U.S. has been importing Venezuelan crude at a trickle since the Biden administration eased sanctions in 2022, but the volumes are still a fraction of what they were before the Trump-era crackdown. The real question is whether the White House will double down on energy diplomacy or use Venezuela as a cudgel in the culture wars. Remember, it was just last year that the Department of Energy quietly approved a license for Chevron to EXD operations in Venezuela, only to see the deal get torpedoed by a bipartisan group of senators led by Bob Menendez, who accused the administration of rewarding dictators. That's the kind of domestic pressure that forces presidents into bad decisions. When you've got a senator from New Jersey threatening to hold up judicial nominees over Venezuela policy, you're not just dealing with foreign adversaries, you're negotiating with your own government. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the establishment's cognitive dissonance is most glaring. The Pentagon has spent the last 2 decades preparing for counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East, not great power competition in the Western Hemisphere. The Southern Command, which would be the tip of the spear in any Venezuela operation, is still structured around drug interdiction and humanitarian missions, not high-intensity conflict. The last time the U.S. tried a regime change operation in Latin America was AMA in 1989, and while that was a tactical success, it was a strategic mess. Noriega was gone, but the U.S. spent the next decade dealing with the blowback from a destabilized isthmus. Fast forward to today, and the U.S. military is stretched thin between Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Red Sea. The idea that it could sustain a prolonged campaign in Venezuela without breaking something else is fantasy. But here's where the domestic politics get really ugly. If the U.S. does nothing, the Republicans will accuse Biden of weakness. If it imposes more sanctions, the left flank of the Democratic Party will scream about collective punishment. And if it even hints at military action, the progressive wing will revolt. We saw this dynamic play out in 2019, when Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Venezuela backfired spectacularly. The administration thought it could starve Maduro out, but all it did was push him closer to Russia and China while accelerating the country's economic collapse. The result? A humanitarian crisis that spilled over into Colombia and Brazil, and a political backlash in the U.S. that handed the House to the Democrats in 2020. The lesson should have been economic warfare has limits, and in Venezuela, those limits have already been reached. So what's the most likely scenario? I'll give you 3, and none of them are pretty. The first is strategic drift, where the U.S. continues its current policy of half measures, easing sanctions just enough to keep the oil flowing but not enough to force real concessions from Maduro. This is the path of least resistance, but it's also the path of least impact. Maduro will keep playing for time, using the threat of Chinese and Russian intervention to extract concessions from Washington while his cronies loot what's left of the country's resources. The second scenario is escalation, where the U.S. imposes secondary sanctions on Chinese and Russian entities doing business in Venezuela, risking a broader economic confrontation. This would be a high-stakes gamble, and it could backfire spectacularly if Beijing or Moscow retaliate by targeting U.S. commies in their markets. The third scenario is the most a miscalculation. Maybe the U.S. tries a limited strike on a Venezuelan military target, or maybe Maduro provokes a border incident with Colombia. Either way, you're looking at a situation where neither side can back down without losing face, and suddenly you've got a shooting war in the Caribbean. Here's the thing about they happen when both sides think they're stronger than they are. The U.S. still believes it can dictate outcomes in its neighborhood, and Maduro believes he can outlast American pressure. But the reality is that Venezuela is a failed state with a broken military, and the U.S. is a superpower with a political system that's allergic to long-term strategy. That's a recipe for disaster. The last time we saw this dynamic was in the 1960s, when the U.S. backed the Bay of Pigs invasion, thinking that a few hundred Cuban exiles could topple Castro. We all know how that ended. The difference now is that the stakes are higher, the players are more dangerous, and the margin for error is razor-thin. So where does that leave us? The most plausible outcome is that the US will muddle through, avoiding both surrender and catastrophe. But muddling through isn't a strategy, it's an admission of failure. The real question is whether Washington can learn from its mistakes before it's too late. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that empires don't collapse because of a single defeat. They collapse because they keep making the same mistakes, over and over, until they run out of options. And right now, the US is running out of options in Venezuela. The only question is whether anyone in Washington is paying attention. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a problem for the US, it's a symptom of a much larger strategic dilemma. The real issue isn't Maduro's survival or even the suffering of the Venezuelan people. It's that Washington has spent the last 3 decades assuming that its unipolar moment would last forever, and now it's being forced to confront the fact that the world has moved on. The US still operates under the assumption that it can dictate outcomes in its own backyard, but the truth is that the Monroe Doctrine died somewhere between the rise of China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's return to the global stage as a spoiler. Venezuela is just the place where that reality is being exposed in the most painful way possible. Let me explain why this matters. The US has 2 grand strategic options in Venezuela, neither of which it seems willing to fully embrace. The first is containment, a long-term, low-intensity approach that accepts Maduro's regime as a fact of life while working to limit its influence. This would mean dialing back the rhetoric, easing sanctions in exchange for incremental concessions, and focusing on stabilizing the region through economic aid and security cooperation with allies like Colombia and Brazil. It's not glamorous, and it certainly wouldn't satisfy the hawks in Congress or the Venezuelan exile community in Miami, but it's the only approach that acknowledges the limits of American power. The problem is that containment requires patience, and patience is something the US political system no longer has. Every 4 years, a new administration comes in with a new set of priorities, and Venezuela gets shuffled from one half-baked policy to the end. Obama tried engagement, Trump tried maximum pressure, Biden tried a mix of both, and now we're back to square one. The second option is rollback, a more aggressive strategy aimed at regime change, either through covert action, economic strangulation, or, in the worst-case scenario, military intervention. This is the path that the US has flirted with for years, and it's the one that keeps leading us to the brink of disaster. The problem with rollback is that it assumes the US can control the aftermath, and history shows that it can't. Look at Iraq in 2003, Libya in 2011, or even Afghanistan in 2001. The US has a long track record of toppling regimes, but it has an even longer track record of failing to replace them with anything stable. Venezuela is no different. The country is a powder keg of hyperinflation, organized crime, and institutional collapse. Even if Maduro were removed tomorrow, the odds of a smooth transition to democracy are slim to none. More likely, you'd get a power struggle between rival factions, a surge in migration, and a new wave of instability that would make the current crisis look like a walk in the park. Here's the uncomfortable: neither containment nor rollback is a perfect solution, but the US keeps acting as if it can have it both ways. It wants to punish Maduro without alienating China and Russia, it wants to support the opposition without being held responsible for the consequences, and it wants to maintain its influence in the region without actually investing the resources to do so. That's not strategy, that's wishful thinking. And wishful thinking is how great powers lose wars, both hot and cold. So what's the alternative? The honest answer is that there isn't a good one, at least not in the short term. But there is a less bad one, and it starts with accepting a few hard realities. First, Maduro isn't going anywhere. The man has survived assassination attempts, mass protests, and crippling sanctions. He's not a genius, but he's a survivor, and he's proven that he can outlast American pressure. Second, China and Russia aren't going to abandon him. For Beijing, Venezuela is a key node in its global energy strategy, and for Moscow, it's a way to poke the US in its own backyard. Third, the Venezuelan opposition is fractured, and even if it weren't, it lacks the institutional capacity to govern effectively. The US can't just anoint a new leader and expect the country to magically stabilize. Given all that, the least bad option is a version of containment that focuses on de-escalation, stabilization, and long-term leverage. De-escalation means dialing back the rhetoric and avoiding actions that could trigger a direct confrontation with Russia or China. That doesn't mean abandoning sanctions entirely, but it does mean being more selective about how and where they're applied. Stabilization means working with regional partners to address the humanitarian crisis and prevent Venezuela from becoming a failed state on Colombia's doorstep. And long-term leverage means investing in the kind of economic and diplomatic tools that can shape outcomes over decades, not months. The problem is that none of this fits neatly into the American political cycle. Presidents want quick wins, Congress wants to look tough, and the media wants dramatic headlines. Containment is slow, boring, and politically unrewarding. But it's also the only approach that doesn't risk making things worse. The alternative is to keep doubling down on failed policies, hoping that this time will be different. And that, as they say, is the definition of insanity. Let me give you an example of how this could play out. Suppose the US were to ease sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for free and fair elections, monitored by international observers. Maduro would almost certainly cheat, but the mere fact of holding elections would create a new dynamic. The opposition would have a platform to organize, the international community would have a benchmark to judge Venezuela's progress, and the US would have a way to calibrate its response. If Maduro rigs the vote, the sanctions snap back. If he allows a relatively free process, the US can ease up further. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a way to break the current stalemate without resorting to regime change fantasies. The bigger question, though, is whether the US is even capable of thinking in these terms anymore. The American foreign policy establishment is still stuck in the post-Cold War mindset, where the US could dictate outcomes through sheer force of will. But the world has changed, and the US is no longer the only player on the board. China and Russia are here to stay, and they're not going to sit idly by while the US tries to rewrite the rules of the game. The sooner Washington accepts that, the sooner it can start developing a strategy that actually works. In the end, Venezuela is a test case for whether the US can adapt to a multipolar world. If it can't, then we're in for a lot more crises like this one, crises where the US is forced into a corner, not because of its enemies, but because of its own inability to think strategically. And that, more than anything else, is what keeps me up at night. Because empires don't fall because of a single defeat. They fall because they keep making the same mistakes, over and over, until they run out of options. And right now, the US is running out of options in Venezuela. The only question is whether anyone in Washington is paying attention.